The biggest question today is this question of war and peace. The choice offered to the world is cooperate or perish. The choice is of peaceful coexistence or no existence at all.
At the dawn of India's independence, a new kind of storm was brewing, not just within its borders, but on a stage where giants clashed and ideologies divided the world. This storm was called the Cold War, a titanic struggle that pitted two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, against each other, casting long shadows across continents. But was it just a fight between two mighty nations? The truth runs deeper. Independent India, it turns out, was actually quite influential in the first 2 decades of its existence, which coincided with the emergent development of US-Soviet bipolar hostilities. From the earliest days of the Cold War, Prime Minister Nehru saw the collision of superpowers as an existential threat to all life, the ultimate culmination of a teleology produced by nationalism that led to violence, war, and finally to total destruction. India saw it as its mission to play global peacemaker, not only to prevent total annihilation under a mushroom cloud, but also to serve a larger human ideal. The dynamics of the Cold War shaped the foreign policy interactions of India and Pakistan from the earliest years of their existence. Indeed, in Asia, the Cold War represented as much of an opportunity as a challenge. In the early 1950s, diplomatic visits by Indian and Pakistani leaders to the superpowers reflected an era of outreach and geopolitical positioning. Nehru's visit to the United States was met with cautious optimism. He admired Western democracy but remained wary of its capitalist model. Still, by many accounts, Nehru's visit to the United States in the winter of 1949 was successful. Among other things, Nehru used the occasion to renew India's request for 1 million tons of wheat from the United States. Moreover, he argued such cooperation would be of immense value, not just for India but also for the US, owing to India's pivotal position in Asia. The US assisted India in acquiring hefty loans from the International Bank during Nehru's visit.
These two republics of the Western world and the Eastern world will find many ways of working together in friendly and fruitful cooperation to our mutual advantage. And
at the same time, however, Truman was warned that the United States could not meet all of India's demands for military aid due to the heavy commitments to other parts of the world by the US. At the same time, it was crucial for the US to reassure the Indians that they would always be available to help India should the situation arise. India, then, was to be cultivated by the United States, based on an assessment that it was a valuable potential ally in the struggle to limit the influence of communism in Asia. In fact, for all of India's insistence on non-alignment, Nehru and his officials had gone out of their way unofficially to assure US representatives that, in the event of a world conflict, India would stand with the United States.
And because it is my conviction that so long as the Kashmir question is not settled, neither Pakistan nor India could be or would be in a position to play their proper role in the maintenance of peace in Asia.
On the eve of Liaquat Ali Khan's visit in 1950 to the United States, the US officials warned the State Department that Pakistan had established trading and diplomatic missions with many nations in Eastern Europe, including Hungary and Poland. something the United States had repeatedly warned its international allies against doing. But due to larger strategic considerations, it made no sense for the US to cut off trade contacts with Pakistan.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. Free nations must be on their guard, more than ever before, against this kind of sneak attack. We are united in detesting communist slavery. We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
The Cold War's first major hot conflict had been raging since 1950 on the Korean Peninsula. From the start, India had counseled restraint and warned of the dire consequences of escalation, while also arguing that efforts to isolate and blame China for aggression would ultimately prove counterproductive. India's first UN experience during the Korean War was fraught and threatened to drag the new nation into the Cold War conflict. India's involvement began when K.P.S. Menon, independent India's most experienced diplomat, was unanimously elected as the chairman of the UN Temporary Commission on Korea in 1948. The Commission's mandate was to observe elections following the withdrawal of Soviet and US troops north and south of the 38th parallel and report to the UN General Assembly. Under Menon's leadership, the Temporary Commission on Korea pushed for elections in a united Korea on the grounds that Korea is one and indivisible. However, Soviet intransigence in allowing the Commission access to Korea north of the 38th parallel, coupled with the US insistence on holding elections only in the south, led to the failure of the Commission's mandate and the de facto division of Korea. The Temporary Commission was replaced by the UN Commission on Korea, which also included an Indian representative. Unsurprisingly, the UN Commission on Korea collapsed when North Korea invaded South Korea on 25 June 1950. When the US sponsored a resolution to permit UN troops to cross the 38th parallel, India opposed it. India's UN representative, Panikkal Rao, argued it would impair faith in the UN if we were even to appear to authorize the unification of Korea by the use of force against North Korea, after we had resisted the attempt of North Korea to reunify the country by force against South Korea. And instead of sending troops, India only fielded a 346-man strong field ambulance unit which stayed until 1954. The US privately asked India to take the lead in formulating an armistice. The Soviets also acquiesced in this request of India. Despite making India a scapegoat, the parties failing to find a solution eventually accepted India's proposed compromise and signed the armistice on 27 July 1953. India's role in bringing the hostilities to an end was belatedly appreciated by the two warring sides. The then Secretary General of the UN acknowledged, the UN could not conceive of a single conflict situation without the cooperation from the countries like India. Some of India's momentum in 1953 was generated by the death of Joseph Stalin, whom Nehru had always distrusted, even as he pursued engagement guided by the belief that a caged bear was always the most dangerous. The next year, that is 1954, saw the first major event that the Soviet Union attended post-Stalin, the Geneva Conference of April-July 1954, where India had a significant presence and played a major role. It was, indeed, the most efficacious year for Soviet-Indo relations. Beginning in May, the Soviet Union began to mention India first in its greetings at the Kremlin to all non-communist countries. On the International Control Commission, formed to deal with French withdrawal from Vietnam, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov pushed for Indian chairmanship on 15 June 1954. Not only did the Soviet Union encourage and insist on Indian participation, but Moscow did this in the face of staunch Western opposition, based mostly on US objections to India's non-aligned position. Nehru remarked to Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, "People in England and America are very courteous to us and friendly, but in the final analysis, they treat India as a country to be humoured but not as an equal. Indeed, the United States hardly treats any other country as an equal. During his trip to India in 1955, Khrushchev liked Nehru's anti-colonialism and socialist disposition and expressed Soviet support for economic and military cooperation with the Third World in general and India in particular. In public speeches, the Soviet leaders even called India an ally. Nehru's high regard for US President Eisenhower led him to distance India from this language of alliances, emphasizing that Indo-Soviet cooperation was not directed against any other country. But on the eve of 1956, the Indian establishment seemed to believe that in the event of an emergency, the Russians would give us anything. However, the United States and Europe were quite critical and made it quite clear that they thought it unwise for a newly independent India to befriend a temporary state.
"29 nations, with a population of more than 1,400,000,000 persons, attend the historic conference in Indonesia's capital city of Bandung."
In 1955, the Bandung Conference brought together nations from Asia and Africa who shared colonial histories and aspirations of freedom. Nehru was a prominent figure, advocating for a collective voice that could resist the pressures of Cold War polarization. This gathering laid the groundwork for the non-aligned movement, which formally came into existence in 1961. This movement was not just a policy but a statement that these countries refused to be mere pawns in the global tug-of-war between capitalism and communism. And in 1956, the Hungarian Revolution erupted, challenging Soviet dominance. As the Soviets suppressed the uprising with force, global condemnation followed. On 25th October 1956, Nehru made his first public statement regarding the uprisings in Poland and Hungary, which he called a nationalist upsurge and a feeling that they themselves are going to fashion their policies and not necessarily others. He did not want to interfere in any way, even by expressing an opinion on the internal affairs of these countries. The Americans were convinced that Nehru had been brainwashed by the Soviets, especially when Nehru referred to the situation in Hungary as being obscure. However, a few months after the events of the Hungarian Revolution had taken place, Nehru wrote to KPS Menon, saying that a succession of foolish actions by the Soviet Union had disrupted the idea of real peace in our generation. Sensing a loss of Indian support, the Soviets sent the ambassador in Delhi to call on Nehru to remind him of Soviet support on the question of Kashmir at the United Nations, in a form of a gentle black, Soviet peace offensive and Nehru's India Mail. Yet, Indian efforts at diplomatic solutions continued. Nehru wrote to Menon, saying, "If war comes, it will come in spite of us."